it clearly had an impact on the way people began to think about economic policy.
I was totally aware that a revolution was starting.
If we did nothing else, we changed the world.
This is how I tasted my first cup of coffee.
Boy, this is the first time in years.
Ooh.
Stand by, ready, 3, take 3, Mike Hewitt.
Knowing for sure whether it was going to work? No. But what a grand experiment.
Take one. My name is Arthur Laffer. I'm an economist. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and we're here in Washington, D.C. at the W Hotel. I was in the OMB. I was the chief economist at the OMB then, and I found my friends up there in the OMB really boring, so I always came down and hung out with the OEO people. Bill Bradley was in that group, and Christine Todd Whitman, and Jim Leach, I think was.
Interns, as I recall.
Yeah, interns, and it was just a fun group of people.
Art Laffer, Dick Cheney, and I would have dinner from time to time, or lunch from time to time, or just have meetings in the White House from time to time.
In 1974, we came to the Hotel Washington, to the Two Continents restaurant. That's where we sat down and talked about tax policy, and Art drew the Laffer curve.
I invited Jude Winniski, who was a writer for the Wall Street Journal at the time. He passed on. But he kept all the records of this stuff. And in an article much later, it was called Taxes, Revenues, and the Laffer Curve, he recounted this dinner. And so it was the four of us. And that is the dinner we're talking about today.
During that time, what we were trying to do, obviously, was manage this transition from the Nixon administration to the Ford administration. And there had never been anything like it.
And the country was faced with some serious economic problems. And what was coming up through the system was not what I felt represented the direction the country should go. And it was in large measure coming, I think it's safe to say, from speechwriters as opposed to economists.
We were spending a lot of time on the economic program that fall.
My gosh.
We were still doing it at Vail at Christmas time.
I remember that very well. We spent a lot of time in ski clothes in the living room of the house that Ford was renting.
Yeah, the Bass House.
Jerry Ford was proposing a tax increase, a 5% tax surcharge. And so I was talking with Don back then, who was chief of staff, and Dick, who was deputy chief of staff. I said, look, guys, you're not going to get 5% more revenue with a 5% tax surcharge. Now, you may get 4% more revenue, you may get 3%. You might also lose revenue because the tax base will shrink. I drew that little curve on a napkin to illustrate that.
It's just one of those events that stuck out in my mind because it's not every day you see somebody whip out a Sharpie and mark up, the cloth napkin at the dinner table. Yeah, he was that way. He drew out a lot of napkins. My recollection is we were in the restaurant, downstairs, sitting at a table about like this, and you drew the curve on the napkin. I was struck by it when you did it. Now, I never got the napkin.
But I have the napkin that's in the Smithsonian was to Don Rumsfeld from Arthur Laffer. And why, if I did that, would Don not have picked it up?
I don't want that trash.
I had to deal with this all the time. But I do all these mathematical models of the effects of taxes, which, if you know the math, it works out pretty nicely, but it doesn't have the sort of the bite, the flavor of the real world. So I would develop all of these anecdotes to try to illustrate the economics, one of which was the Laffer curve, which if you tax people at 100%, no one will work because they don't get an incentive to work, and the government will collect no revenues. If you tax people at 0%, everyone will work like mad, but you're not collecting any revenues.
Well, basically, the curve showed that with a tax rate of 0, you were going to collect 0 taxes. With a tax rate of 100%, you're going to collect 0 revenue. You shut down the economy.
It had the power of simplicity. It was a truth that could be expressed in a paragraph. We each turned to each other and said, Arthur Laffer is absolutely brilliant. My memory's not perfect. I'm 82 years old. I could be wrong.
Here's a question for you. When did Reagan first see the Laffer curve?
Well, Reagan, I used to have, like with you, Don, I used to have lunch with Reagan during the 76 to 80 period. And he'd come in, just the two of us, and he'd come in with all these paper stacks and with paper clips in them and ask me questions about it. Marty Anderson wrote in the book Revolution. He remembered the day he saw it and understood it. And he said, I just saw the president, but I don't remember that, to be honest with you. I remember doing that with the president. But politics is where the rubber hits the road. I'm not held responsible for public policy. I'm this guy sitting at the dinner and I go home at night. They actually are held accountable. But they understood what I said. They understood the context in which it was done. And then they had to take those ideas and blend them with the politics in the real world.
It clearly had an impact on the way, at least on our side of the aisle, people began to think about economic policy and tax policy and revenues and growth. So it was, for me, it was a significant moment in my own development, if I can put it in those terms.
It was so simple and so compelling that the traditional liberal view was contested. The traditional conservative view of it was contested.
It's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not liberal, it's not conservative, it's not left-wing, it's not right-wing. It's economics. Okay, vertical axis, horizontal axis, tax revenues.
Vertical is the tax rate, in case you forgot. And the curve goes out like this. You may not remember that.
It's a bell curve.
It's a bell curve, yeah.
Here's 100% right here. This is a 0.
Where's Jude when we need him?
Jude should be here, though. You know, it really is sad because he made all of this stuff really happen. It was amazing. This time I'm going to make this to my friend, Dick Cheney. You got the first one and you gave it away, Don.
Pardon me?
Saving the
Oh, you're saving it?
This time he's getting it.
This time I'm going to get the
It's going to go in the Cheney Museum.
Right.
Right.
Old friends are the best friends, and there's no question but that we've all three been friends for many, many decades now. Something, I suppose, exceeding 40 years, 4 decades.
These are my two favorite people, as you can tell.
As long as we agreed with him, he liked us.
Don Rumsfeld and I have been close friends for 40 years. He fundamentally changed my life, got me off the academic track and into politics and government. Art's, I say, one of the more interesting personalities around, and so I have lunch and somebody else paid for it. Yeah.
What does it say here?
That's classified.
This game had never been seen in the wild before. I was just dying to see how people would adapt to it.
The garage is a bit of a myth. It didn't serve much purpose, except it was something for us to feel that it was our home. We had no money. You have to work out of your home when you have no money.
Boy, this is the first time in years. Doing this all from memory. It's just hard to remember in old computer language.
I not only designed this, every little metal trace that you see on here, I strapped onto a drafting table, and I built this whole board myself because I wanted the chips in the ultimate perfect position. I worked for a couple of weeks every night till about 4 in the morning, laying out the little things on a big drafting table that would eventually become this board. And when I got done, I realized I had to drill 8 holes in the board. And I said, you know what? If I had only designed it a little bit differently, then I would have only had 5 holes. I tore apart my entire design, and for another 2 weeks, every night till 4 in the morning, to get it just that perfect with only 5 holes, so you would never see the 3 missing. It had to be that artistically perfect to me, because it represents yourself when you do a great design.
Over here, we've got the very first computer we ever built, long before we even started a company, and I hand wired the entire bottom, soldered it all together. That was an Apple I, the first Apple I computer ever.
Does it get boring to tell a story?
Never.
Never gets boring?
Never. It's in my heart. Those were the most incredible times. The summer that I built the Apple I computer, I was totally aware that a revolution was close to starting. I'd been showing off my computer at the Homebrew Computer Club. I had given away my designs for the Apple I for free. Steve Jobs came into town. He'd pop into town, see what I was up to, the latest thing I designed for fun, and then he'd somehow turn them into some money for both of us. Paul Terrell, he owned a store in Mountain View. He'd seen me for quite a long time demonstrating my computer. So Steve Jobs went in to sell him some of our little boards that we built for 20 bucks. He said, no. People want to come in, they want to buy it pre-built. They want to buy the thing ready to go. It cost us $250 to build maybe. We'd sell it for $500. And then the retail price was $666.66 because I, as a mathematician, like repeating digits. And that was what it should be. The garage is a bit of a myth. It's overblown. The garage represents us better than anything else, but we did no designs there. We would drive the finished products to the garage, make them work, and then we'd drive them down to the store that paid us cash. We outgrew that garage, though, very quickly. It wasn't like, it's a whole company. You walk in, a bunch of people have desks. There were hardly ever more than 2 people in the garage, and mostly they were just sitting around kind of doing nothing productive. I was very much a geek. I was a social outsider. I didn't look at the world in normal ways when I was young. I wanted my own computer my whole life. I had told my dad in high school, someday I am going to own a big computer. This board right here in 6. The wires are not. So I was happy. Once I had that Apple I computer, I was happy for life. But the Apple II was the great machine that was going to really turn the world on end. Where's the case? The Apple II I did the best genius work of my life that I was well known for saving parts, for condensing things, for getting extra performance, for doing things people never imagined.
This is our millionth Apple II computer, and that's why it's gold. And a million sounds like a large number, but you remember number 1, you remember number 100. This is number 1,000,000 of the Apple IIs, and that'll probably seem small in a couple of years.
See, we had 2 phases. This garage was a little partnership with a partnership agreement. It was small stuff. The Apple II was the big company. We got an investment. Once we had an investment, that's when Steve's personality changed. And he was going to be businessman. He wasn't going to be joking anymore. He was going to be dressed in a suit on the cover of the magazines. And that was his role in life. Steve just felt like computers somehow added up to companies that could make money. When we went public, a few of us became unbelievably wealthy. We were worth so many millions and hundreds of millions. I designed these machines because I wanted computers for myself, and I wanted to help, revolutions happen, and didn't really want that kind of wealth. I don't remember the beep command, do I? Too bad I wrote it in my own language. Ooh. Yeah, I got it right. Run. It says, hello, my name is Steve. You can barely see it, but it's there. Soldering things together, putting the chips together, designing them, drawing them on drafting tables. It was so much a passion in my life, and to this day, I'll stay at the bottom of the org chart being an engineer because that's where I want to be.
Stand by, ready, 3, take 3, mic here.
The notion then was, can we actually fill 24 hours a day with news? So far as knowing for sure whether it was going to work, no. But what a grand experiment. You hear 10 seconds, 5 seconds, and again 5, 4, and then they'd shut up and you just see their finger. And then you're on. I mean, literally, you're on. And a certain aspect of your personality, if you get in this business, you got to be on to a certain degree. Well, not quite the same.
How many years did Lois sit on your left?
Many, many, many years. We met in about 1976 when we were both working at a TV station in Sacramento.
She was on one end of the newsroom, I was on the other end, and Eventually, I spotted this really attractive, tall, leggy blonde, very good reporter, newscaster. And I remember remarking to a friend of mine, I said, I'm going to marry her. And I did marry her.
We married in 1979, about a year before we came to CNN. That was sort of the heyday of local anchors. There were no other options for watching TV, and so we had huge ratings.
The notion then was, can we actually fill 24 hours a day with news? So far as knowing for sure whether it was going to work, no. But what a grand experiment.
Stand by, ready, 3, take 3, Mike here.
6 p.m., June 1st, 1980, was the first cablecast of CNN.
And Ted Turner threw to CNN and the studio inside, and now I think he said CNN News.
Good evening, I'm David Walker.
And I'm Lois Hart. Now here's the news. President Carter has arrived in Fort...
We found out we were going to be the anchors of that newscast about, what, 3 or 4 days before that?
Probably.
And it's kind of like, wow, you know, you just kind of swallowed hard. We were told anyway, the reason we were selected. Ted just, whatever reason.
Yeah, Ted
just liked our style.
Ted was the one who made the choice.
You know, whatever we did on air, he thought we would best represent CNN at that time. And so it was because of Ted, and quite an honor.
I dedicate the news channel for America.
Ted Turner is a visionary, very smart, little crazy, brilliant businessman. Brilliant, brilliant businessman.
When he created CNN, they did research. They said, don't do it. It's not going to work. It's a bad idea. You're going to lose money. And he rolled every cent. He's a Mississippi riverboat gambler. He rolled every nickel he had in that operation. And sure enough, it did work.
Skies over Baghdad have been illuminated.
The first Gulf War, when CNN had live reports coming out of Baghdad, and the great visuals of the bombs going off and some terrific reporting going on, I think that's when the world and the nation, everybody said, that was a wow moment.
It's interesting that most of what people talk about when they're in the news is how fluffy and light news in general has gotten. The argument being they don't want hard news, and we're going to try softer programming.
But I don't have a problem with that. That's part of a day. So let's say out of 10 stories, you can have 1 or 2 that is of vital interest and importance. The rest of them are just fun to watch and amusing.
CNN has provided a product over the years that the world would never have gotten any other way, which is a window to the world, really, that wouldn't have happened and wouldn't have driven all the rest of the cable networks to even be born.
There was a moment in time when the board was trying to pull the plug on all the funds and have it not run. Steve was there with Wozniak, and he said, well, I'll pay for half of it if you will.
On December 5th, 1973.
The Super Bowl was always a venue for a huge audience. But Master Lock was the only one that did something exclusively for the Super Bowl until we did 1984. What makes something memorable? I think the challenge has always been to break rules, find something new, find something unexpected as a way of engaging people and telling a story. I met Steve when he was 24 years old. Steve, from the day I met him, was passionate and believed totally that this technology wasn't just going to be a business for him and it wasn't just going to be a hobby for Wozniak. This was going to change the world.
Today, 1 year after Lisa, we are introducing the third industry milestone product, Macintosh.
So there was this challenge from Steve. I got to introduce Macintosh. It's got to be dramatic. It's got to be famous. It's got to be different. We had a meeting where we presented a whole bunch of thinking that went into launching Macintosh. He thought it was brave, he thought it was great. It was the board of directors thinking it was really stupid and irresponsible. And there was a moment in time when the board was trying to pull the plug on all the funds and have it not run. And he was there with Wozniak, and he said, well, I'll pay for half of it if you will. They didn't have to come to that, but they did make that overture at one point. So you open on this place that represents the future, with people marching to a central hall. Our idea was that Big Brother represented the control of technology by the few. Lots of people decided, partly by the bluish quality, partly by the competitive situation Apple found themselves in, that Big Brother represented IBM. And that really wasn't the intent, but it probably worked on that level as well. But running down one of the corridors was a girl who you saw glimpses of. She came bursting into the back of the room, and she stopped and swung once, twice, and then heaved the hammer. And a giant explosion.
And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
1984 wasn't designed to only run on the Super Bowl. It was designed to have a media life beyond the Super Bowl, but the board of directors at Apple decided it was irresponsible, since it didn't show the product and the product wasn't even available yet, to continue running it. And that becomes almost part of the legend. Oh, and the genius of just running it once on the Super Bowl. Every news show the next morning was basically saying, the game was okay, but did you see the commercial? Our vision was more about the idea of how the world was going to change because of computers, not that we were changing the Super Bowl that day. But it did create a phenomenon where people started thinking, designing advertising specifically for the Super Bowl and keeping it secret and having it be a surprise. All those things were kind of born out of 1984 running once. Trying to live up to what Steve expected of what I did and what we were doing together became one of the, true kind of joys of my life. To be in the advertising business, you don't often get to be part of something that important, that world-changing. Lots of people kind of misjudged what the commercial was and what the commercial could do, and of course nobody believed that 30 years later people would still be talking about it.
One key problem in many developing countries, there is a very high prevalence of iron deficiency anemia.
If we just get people to use this salt, we're going to get a big step against anemia. So it really will change their lives.
I was always troubled by poverty, troubled by the different circumstances that people experience in the world, troubled by the fact that some people are poor, while I live in this comfortable middle-class existence in France. Only much later that I understand that economics could be a way into this understanding. I'm interested in how poor people make decisions about their lives. Understanding of these decisions can help us design programs and interventions that help them live a better life.
There's obviously a lot of poverty in the world, but there's also a lot of aid. So why isn't there more results?
Now, a lot of money is being spent on the poor. What's the effectiveness of that money? Is it well spent? Is it not well spent? That's what we are trying to find out now.
Part of the problem of aid is that the natural tendency is not to be too scientific about it. What happens really if you give them a handout? Is it really awful stuff that happens, or is it the case that basically, it helps them a little bit and makes them a little happier? One of the advantages of doing the kind of work we do is that we can start to put a wedge between those. We can start saying, that's not true. There's some places where we do know the facts. And you can't just tell me that, anything goes. And I think that's a long way down the road towards sort of getting more science into this decision.
My mother is a pediatrician, and Currently, today, as we speak, she's in El Salvador in a mission with Doctor of the World. And she was doing that when we were growing up. You know, I grew up with a very strong notion of responsibility to at least not ignore that issue. And then on the other side, my dad is an academic, he's a mathematician. You know, I kind of always hoped I would be an academic too. When I got into the profession, a little more than 15 years ago now, we didn't have that many answers. So it was a very excited, wide-open place to start working and say, well, I'm going to go like slowly, take one question after the other and answer a few. And then, of course, many more people are also doing that. And together, I think we are starting to make some progress.
Intellectually, we're very similar people. In some ways, even though she grew up in France and I grew up in Calcutta, we have very similar backgrounds. JPAL was created to catalyze this process of knowledge building through doing experiments.
It was started at MIT, and then very closely after we started this office, the office here in India, and then now we have offices in every continent except Oceania.
We wanted to do only randomized controlled trials on issues that are relating to poverty.
So the concept is really very similar to a clinical trial. You take a population of people, randomly select half of your population, give them the new drug, and the other half gets the standard of care or a placebo. And then, because they've been randomly selected, they look exactly the same. You can compare them and get good answer on the effectiveness of your drug. You can do exactly the same for any social programs. That's what the randomization gives you. Very good sense of the effect of the intervention.
Usually I'll wander around and try to listen in on the surveys, because the one useful thing you can do is sort of figure out what, there's often a gap between what you think is the question and what's the question that's being asked. So when I listen to it, the way it's actually being worded is very important.
One key problem in many developing countries, but in particular in South Asia, there's a very high prevalence of iron deficiency anemia. So we thought, would it be possible to make double fortified salt available in the villages at a reduced price? Would people buy it? If they do, would that improve their anemia level?
If we just get people to use this salt, we're going to get a big step against anemia. It could improve test scores, improve work performance, improve incomes, all kinds of great things. It would really change our attitude towards this problem. It would turn into a solvable problem.
There are many partners in the world, that's governments, NGOs, private companies, who recognize, for having worked in the field in reality, that things are not always the way you envision them to be. The only questions you can ask is a particular program, is a particular policy effective? And then, are there ways to make it more effective? Which is exactly what JPAL is doing. I keep getting surprised at what people do, the ideas they have, and the creativity they bring to the table. And at the end of the day, that's what drives us.
Before Starbucks, I think in the mid-'70s, people were drinking instant coffee, Maxwell House U-Ban, and perking it at home, and it wasn't very good.
We tried to sell the consumer pong at the toy fair in New York. Oh. We sold none. And we said, what's wrong with this?
The incomparable goodness of coffee has now been captured in a cup.
Before Starbucks, I think in the mid-'70s, people were drinking really bad coffee. They were drinking instant coffee, Maxwell House U-Ban, and perking it at home, and it wasn't very good.
Your first cup of Starbucks coffee was?
In the Pike Place store in 1979, 1980, it was a French press of Sumatra.
How much coffee is too much coffee?
I drink about 4 to 5 cups of coffee a day.
What do you say when doctors say cut down on your coffee?
To me, they don't say that. they don't say that. just came for the day?
Just came for the day. You're the highlight of our day.
Oh.
Yeah, you are.
Thank you for your compliment.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. When I came here for the first time, had never been in a Starbucks store. Walked into this very store, and by the way, we have changed nothing through the years. This is the original store as is. And they handed me a cup of coffee made this way. Now, this is a cup of Sumatra, which is Indonesian coffee. This is how I tasted my first cup of coffee. And I just knew from that moment on that I was home. Did I ever imagine that we would one day have stores in 65 countries serving almost 80 million customers a week? No. Growing up in Brooklyn in the projects in the early 60s, what I would loosely describe as the other side of the tracks, provides a deep sense of understanding that there's a world out there that's very, very different than the world that is inside where we grew up. And I wanted to be part of that world. When I finished school, I got hired by a great company, and that was Xerox. And I worked there for a number of years, but I just didn't feel I belonged in a very structured environment. So I left Xerox, and I went to work for a large Swedish company that was starting a U.S. consumer division. In a very roundabout way, they had a customer in Seattle, Washington called Starbucks. Their aspiration at the time was to expand to Portland, Oregon. I somewhat persuaded them that perhaps Starbucks' opportunity was bigger, and they needed someone like me. You have to understand, Starbucks had 3 stores in '82, but the core business was just selling pounds of ground and roasted coffee for home use. A year after I joined the company, I went to Italy for the first time. First of all, you can't walk through any major city or town in Italy without running into a coffee bar and seeing the sense of community and the romance and theater around espresso. It just made me realize that Starbucks perhaps was not in the right part of the coffee business, that the real business and the opportunity was the integration of the beverage to creating a destination and a sense of community in the store. What I experienced in Italy was something that was transferable in the U.S. Bring, for the first time, great coffee, introduce new beverages that no one ever heard of. No one heard of a cafe latte before. I raced home to talk to the founders about the experience I had, and they rejected it. Over a period of 2 years, I left Starbucks to start my own chain of Italian coffee bars. At that time, Starbucks found itself in financial difficulties. And so the founder came to me and said, I can't think of Starbucks in better hands than if it was in your hands. I realize you don't have the money. I'll give you X amount of time to try and find it. I was able to buy Starbucks in August of '87. They had 6 stores at the time for $3.8 million. I didn't, at that point, have an understanding that coffee would one day become part of the culture or the zeitgeist in ways that I couldn't possibly understand or predict. I think we realized early on that what we had to do is everything had to prove itself in the cup. The ability to source and roast the highest quality Arabica beans in the world gave us the platform to do things that would define and build an industry that did not exist. Many people at the time were convinced Starbucks was too strong, and we had to educate the market and the customer about, no, this is what coffee should taste like. And there you have it.
He kept criticizing it's got to have a score, it's got to, and so I made it playable. I didn't know it was a throwaway, and we put the speed up and all this other little angles and worked on it.
And we found ourselves playing it after work for hours.
The simplest game you could think of.
Simplest game you could think of.
1 spot, 2 paddles, and a score.
Nolan was a dreamer.
An entrepreneur, extrovert.
It was a dream I had, and I always felt that it was going to win. I just didn't realize it was going to win quite so quickly.
Absolutely, we changed the world. If we did nothing else, we changed the world.
I was the youngest Silicon Valley president. I sort of plowed the field to make it easier for Jobs and Gates and those guys to plant.
Okay, yeah.
My family was always a game player, from Clue to Monopoly to chess, and I learned chess very, very early on. The epiphany for me was my third grade teacher gave me the responsibility to teach electricity to the class. And I got to play with the magic box that was locked in the closet, and it had dry cells and wires and switches and lights. And so I started tinkering and never stopped.
No one came up with this thing. He says, how come on a TV set, when you change the vertical hold, the picture goes up, and you turn it the other way, the picture goes down? He says, could we do that horizontally too? I said, well, we could do it digitally. So that's when I invented the motion circuitry. So Nolan asked Al to use that motion circuitry of mine.
Al is a better engineer than I am, you know, by far.
And get that on tape now. Put that down.
The day that Al was to show up, I heard about this thing from Magnavox. I had competition, and I was scared. And so I went up to Burlingame, and they had 2 or 3 Magnavox Odysseys set up. And I looked at it, and it was fuzzy and didn't have sound, didn't have score. But I looked around, and people were kind of having fun with it.
Odyssey. It's new from Magnavox.
I had to tell Al what I wanted him to do. And I thought a good training program would be this ping pong game. And so to put a little bit of spice into it, I told him I had a deal with General Electric, which was totally bupkis.
You lied to me, Nolan.
I lied to you.
But he kept criticizing it. It's got to have a score. It's got to, you know. And so I made it playable. I didn't know it was a throwaway, and we put the speed up and all this other little angles and worked on it.
And we found ourselves playing it after work for hours.
We were playing it and everything, really good. And Nolan said, oh, no, we want a driving game. And Al and I said, no, this game is much too much fun.
We decided we were going to test it.
So we got Ted Dabney built a box over a cabinet over the weekend.
You know, contact paper over plywood.
Yeah. Whatever he had. The orange paint was whatever he had, I think. And I went to the Walgreens drugstore and bought a $75 Hitachi TV set and turned it into a monitor. So here we are, Nolan.
Here we are.
Wow, it's changed a lot.
A lot. When we put the Pong in here, it was just on the other side of this green pillars on a barrel. And remember, this place was a different kind of place.
Oh, peanuts on the floor.
Peanuts on the floor, and some of the barrels were for peanuts, unshelled peanuts.
Right. This game had never been seen in the wild before. There were no instructions. There was nothing like it. And so I was just dying to see how people would adapt to it, how quickly. And boom, they started having fun with it really quick.
All of a sudden, Al gets this call saying, hey, the machine's broken. So Al runs down there to find out what's going on.
I remember I got the call that stopped working.
Turned out the coin mechanism had filled up so high it was jammed. Jammed with too many coins.
So I opened up the coin mech, just the quarters came out, and I filled my pockets, and then I called you up and said, hey, Nolan, I think we have a good sign here. That was a tricky shot.
Not.
Ooh, almost got that corner. One sure way to win. Yeah, that's it. That's it. The paddle doesn't go up all the way. Now that was a feature.
That was actually a fault. Oops.
It was a bug. It was a bug in the circuit that I was going to get back to and fix later. And then we realized that if we didn't have that, 2 good players could play forever. So hence my expression: if you can't fix it, call it a feature.
Home gaming was important because it allowed a much broader dissemination of electronic game playing into the population. We tried to sell the consumer Pong at the toy fair in New York. We sold none. And we said, what's wrong with this?
Yeah, I mean, here we were at the toy fair with a product that would, in fact, become the hit product of the decade. So we cold called the Sears Tower and got through to Tom Quinn, the buyer in sporting goods, that was trying to sell the Magnavox Odyssey game. 2 days later, he's on our doorstep at 8 o'clock in the morning. That was such a stroke of luck.
Quinn says, how many can you make by Christmas? And I said, 75,000. And then he came back with an order for 150,000.
Right.
I said, we can't possibly build this many because we just don't have the capital. He says, oh, let me introduce you to Sears Bank.
Yeah.
Pong was the one that got everybody's attention. We created the video game industry because we made the first commercially viable video game. And then from then on, everybody, moved on from there.
Games are part of the DNA of most people, whether it be smartphones, Oculus Rift. I think it's all going to be blended into this interactive slurry of fun. The ability to play anywhere, play anything is bound to be a continuing saga of the world.